And as I said, look, people used to say, well, it's very difficult being an intensivist, all those people. And I would go, no, it isn't. It's really easy. What you do, that's really difficult because there's no way I'm doing that. My 25 people are all unconscious and not moving. And if I decide they're going to wake up, I'll wake them up. Your lot are running around the class and I think that, there isn't enough. The very fact that you're hosting this conversation, that's where the value is. So which one of you actually runs this? Who's the creative genius in this? I'm just trying to...
Me.
I can see what I
debate that.
Do you? Well, you're the head, aren't you? You're the most sort of organised type person.
Oh, I don't know about that.
We know.
Yeah, we know. This came about during COVID. Sam was on long service leave, and we talked about this and talked about the reasons why we wanted to do it. And I guess it took about 6 months of testing out and borrowing equipment and trying to find spaces to do it and the kind of content that we wanted to talk about. And then we had to apply for all the funding, which we got through Scotch parents and old Scotch collegians to try and get all this kind of facilitated, all the equipment bought.
And has the feedback been good? Have people appreciated what you're doing?
Yeah, I think so. We do get some good feedback, but I think we also live in a world where there's a lot of just people want quick answers. They want a meme and they want a photo, and I don't know. Yeah. I don't know if there's enough people investing the time into...
What do you want? What do you want out of these podcasts? Well, why do you do them?
We want people to learn about education and understand what teachers are going through and try and find progressive forms of education and just to explore progressive education.
Because I suspect most people don't even think about education. So actually what you're doing is not so much giving them answers, just having them ask questions about, how does education work? Why do teachers do
Well, we're really interested in it. We talk about it all the time, and we've talked about it for we talked about it for 10 years non-stop. Education, I think that's pretty much all we talk about, right? That and music, but
it was also spawned by this whole conversation we've been having as a engineer and STEM teacher and a philosophy teacher, and the conversations about the things that work in the classroom and what we want to change. And then we both read this book called Range. It was written by this gentleman, David Epstein, and it was Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World is the tagline for the book. That's fascinating.
And because medicine's gone like that. You see, there are almost no generalists anymore. There are only specialists. Okay. And the irony is the generalists who decide which of the specialists to ask for help. Like if we on intensive care, if I asked a cardiologist to see a patient,
it would be a heart problem.
He'd look at the heart.
Yeah, well,
so he's going to say it's a heart problem. We go, is it?
That was exactly the analogy that they used in the book. So one of them was when you ask a cardiologist, that's what the problem's going to be.
Absolutely.
So you need to tackle all problems, whether they're medical or not, with a range of backgrounds.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's something we both value in our lives as well as in education. And
that whole concept of de-siloing education to some extent, where you get kids to
teach
think.
maths and then they teach science, but they can't apply anything in between.
Yeah,
well, it's interesting, isn't it? The philosopher and a scientist, and actually there was a time when they were the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
When the philosophers didn't understand how stuff worked, they still pondered what the meaning of it was, and that there must be an underlying order to it that people didn't understand. I mean, Socrates wasn't a scientist as such; he was a philosopher who made assumptions about how things must work.
Natural world
that
worked.
Can't be true. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, look at what's his name in the 14th, 15th century, who wasn't allowed to say that he realised that the Earth didn't.
Oh, Galileo.
Galileo wasn't allowed to say what he realised was that the sun doesn't go round the Earth; it's the other way around.
Yeah,
because that was you couldn't say that. You couldn't say that. It was heresy. You couldn't say that. And maybe in some ways, I'm not likening you two to Socrates and Galileo, although I don't mind that. But actually, some of the education ideals and processes, actually, you can't say.
Well, I think it's labels as well. Like even like I wouldn't even just define us as scientist and philosopher. I mean, some people would label.
You're definitely much more the philosopher. I mean, you're the surfing dude, not
Well, yeah, and like you know, you have these labels.
Yeah.
And it's not always helpful.
No, God, no. It was, in fact, yeah, you're right. It was very difficult, and you conform because that earned you plaudits and a certain sense of self-worth. And one of the things that was one of the issues that I suffered when I lost my career was actually I realised how much of my self-worth was based on society's, oh, you're a doctor, are you? You know, you go to meet people, oh, Bruce is a doctor. And I go, really? But actually, you kind of got off on it. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I kind of came around to, well, so what? You know, I just got, that's just how I was trained.
Well, there's good status involved with being a doctor as well.
Yeah, but why? The problem is from my experience was that it's a very high, it's a lofty pedestal.
Because it's hard to get into, I guess.
And, well, there you go. Yeah, but veterinary science is more difficult. Why? Because there's a few places and... You know, who wants to, I don't know, stick their hand up a cow's bottom all day? It doesn't do it for me. But then again, engineering, you know, I don't know, being a CEO of a company, there's definitely more plaudits to be had. But medicine still seems to sit at a certain, well, it's the most trusted profession, isn't it? There's a certain belief that somehow we're different. And actually, one of the things that I write about a lot is that it's not different.
Yeah.
In fact, they're the same people. They just happen to be clever.
Well, you asked one of the reasons why we got into this as well is because we value education. We think that it should be valued.
I agree.
At a much higher level from society than what it currently is, and so to talk about it and to understand the complexities of it is something that we're trying to do with this.
It depresses. You're absolutely right. It depresses me when I hear people, I hear the conversation around teaching, and I think, you know, as you said, there's
so much negativity associated with it.
It's the core, and as you said, it's the core of the society where we are now, and I don't understand how we can have slipped. I think it's because, again, it's tick boxes, and it's, you know, year 1, year 2, year 3, this is what we do, and actually that's the very easy thing to do. But actually, education, as you clearly believe,
an art.
Is so much. Oh,
it's an art, but it's become very bureaucratic.
Oh, well, honestly, when I see, as you said, I see and I hear. My sister's a teacher, and I hear them talk about the hoops to jump through simply to tick boxes and satisfy government requirements is so depressing when it has nothing to do with education in that sense.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, let's get an intro before we get too deep.
Yeah.
You planned one?
Well,
you can't have an intro. There's nothing to say, really.
We're not going to muck around. We're getting straight into it.
We're already into it. But
yeah.
Good.
So, all right. You ready, Bruce?
I'm ready, thank you.
We're going to use. We're recording all this stuff.
Yeah. We've already started. But
Yeah,
for those of you that don't want to know a little bit about who our guest is, we should probably say a couple of things if they've lasted this long in the podcast.
Yeah, they're probably left by now.
Yeah.
All right, Bruce Powell. Welcome to Scotch College,
Thank you.
welcome to the Range Project.
Thank you.
All right, let's get straight to it. Bruce, can you tell us a little bit about your childhood, what it was like, and how you would characterise your own learning as a kid?
So the simple answer to that is I've absolutely no idea. I never particularly thought much about education. You turned up because that's what you did. Maths and English was dead easy. I didn't really understand what the point was because, you know, I could read at a very early age and I could do maths and stuff. And so I think a lot of it was a bit mysterious, you know, a bit kind of and boring. So, you know, the junior school that I went to, once you'd done your work for the day, you could go and play football or go and play cricket. So within an hour of the stuff going out, I'd done it and I'd be outside, and that was how it was, and that's great. And so actually what happened was is the merit was simply in doing what you were told till it was done and going away, and not really, we talked about education. You're not aware. It's like, you know, like if you, like someone once said to me, they tossed me a ball and I caught it, and somebody said, how did you do that? Now anyone who catches a ball or surfs, or people say, how do you do that? You go, what do you mean? What do you mean, how did I catch it? I caught it. And they go, yeah, but how did you do that? And you go, I've no idea. Look, maths and English, I don't know why I know. And ironically, when I look at people, for example, who are artistic in a painting sense, I have no idea how you make brushstrokes on a piece of paper look like a face. But people who do know go, well, you just want. I remember I bought my dad Jack Nicklaus's golf video. And he comes up and, hi, I'm Jack Nicklaus. That's a terrible impression. Puts the ball, I like to put the ball down between my feet. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, go on, Jack. Yeah. And then I hit it and he smashes it. It's like, yeah, Jack, if I could do that, I wouldn't have bought your video. Do you know what I mean? There's that. So that's why so often I think.
So what did you find when you were a kid? What were the things that you found really easy, other than the general
everything.
Content?
Reading, maths, English, even languages.
But you were stuck on the why. That seems to be one of the things. You're like, why am I doing this? And bigger picture.
And you know, I'm more than that. So when the teacher asks a question and you jump up and down and put your arm up and shout, and they go, Bruce, shut up. Okay, just put your hand down. No, but you asked the question. I know the answer. I know the answer. Yeah, I get that. So why don't we let anyone else? And my response to that was why? Why are we? What are we waiting for? But again, you know, as a young boy, you're very kind of self-centered, aren't you? I think, you know, I never really thought about my performance and my behaviour in an educational sense until, you know, the last 4 years when I've had time to think about it. Largely, you just steam on because that's how you are. You know, like I said, you catch a ball.
And you would have been just labelled a naughty kid,
yeah,
rather than
absolutely.
ADHD wasn't that well diagnosed.
No, God, it wasn't even a thing. I mean, obviously, you know, when I look back at the history of it, you know, 1900 or so it started, and then the 1960s they started calling it. Absolutely not. In fact, as I said, my teacher's comments for me would be that, yeah, I was pretty annoying, and you know, wouldn't sit still and stuff.
So describe the kind of things that you were feeling. There was some impulse control.
Oh,
I guess.
I didn't even know what impulse control was.
Focus issues, hyper focus.
Well, you get thrown out of the class. You know the answer, so you jump up and down, and they go, "Be quiet," and you just you can't. You just want to. You're so excited. Actually, I think what it is it's a management of energy levels for me. My was I was so excited that I knew what you were talking about. I was engaging. You as a teacher, you've asked a difficult question, and I know the answer. I want to tell you. I want to share that. But actually, in a classroom setting, you can't do that. You know, you can't do that. And I found that very difficult. And look, I got 5 brothers and sisters. It was the same at home. You know, I've already told at least 3 of my siblings that they've all got ADHD as well. And my mum is barn door. But in those days, you know, we were energetic, we were enthusiastic. It was slightly chaotic, quite random, but also very exciting and very enthusing. And so I was always enthusiastic. It's just the controlling of those levels in a classroom situation, I think, is very difficult. And yeah, I was never labelled with anything remotely. There was no label, just that I was bloody annoying.
Mm. Was it a creative, imaginative?
No, not so
home
much.
That you lived in with your siblings, I mean?
No, not really. No, I was quite a real. Ironically, it's really weird because I think everyone who comes from a big family wishes they were a single kid, and everyone who's a single kid wishes they came from a big family. I remember watching John Boy Walton. He's always arguing with his sisters, and it was seemingly a lovely thing. But actually, I found 4 sisters really difficult and really annoying, and I would try to find space on my own, and I would watch the TV on my own, and I would watch Open University programs. You know, those weird ones with black and white with the skinny blokes with beards and big. And I'd watch. And my mum said to me, you know, when you were 4, you started telling me that Mr. Gabberty held the radiators to the floor. And she said, what are you talking about? She said, I realise you're talking about gravity. And you've obviously been watching something and kind of. But again, that was just, again, like the catching the ball, that was just. You kind of got it or you didn't. And I've often heard people talk about art, or indeed the real maths geniuses who go, well, I can just do that. And you go, yeah, but how? And they go, I don't know. So again, I think one of the challenges, and we talked about labels, you know, whether it's good or bad to have labels, I think if people tell you who you are or give you a broader brushstroke of the kind of things that you like and don't like, maybe that's helpful. In my day, you were just thrown out of the class and you stood outside and,
How did you said some of your siblings potentially have ADHD? The ones that didn't have ADHD, or you don't think they do, whether they're diagnosed or not, how did they react to the?
They were the quieter ones. They were the sort of.
They get frustrated at the time management.
Yeah, you kind of just get resigned. I think at a table of 8 of you at dinner, 2 or 3 of you would sit there and just savour the chaos. And like my wife, I met my wife when we were 16, 17, and she kind of came for dinner around Christmas and was just blown away that the whole thing was chaos. My dad wasn't like that, but literally this huge long table and people just conversations across conversations. Never listened to anyone. I'm a terrible listener, and it's something I really have to force myself to do. We never listened to anybody because we were so, like, if you say something that's really interesting to me, I feel compelled to interrupt you because it's interesting. If I'm not interested, I won't.
So it's a compliment if you're interrupted.
I think so. And again, the problem is, of course, it's very hard to gain information from someone if you interrupt them, because you straight away think, "Oh, that's interesting," and actually, I suspect that over the 20 years of time through medicine, I gradually, particularly with Donate Life, the last 7 years when really, as a leader, you really had to listen. I think you probably learned to listen a bit, and so even those proclivities to interrupt and energetic, I think they can be managed, and maybe that's where
the labelling comes in. Because
maybe that's good.
You can understand. Okay, well, this is why. Maybe there's some strategies other people know. You can research it.
I think strategies. Yeah, I think there you go. I think strategies. I think when you say to someone, "Look, you may be someone who does X, Y, or Z. These are things to watch out for." I think that probably would have been useful. For me, I suspect it would have become an excuse that actually concentrating. See, as we've talked about, ADHD isn't a problem with the ability, attention. It's not a problem with attention. It's a problem with holding that attention and focusing that attention, and that's very difficult. And I think there's with a maturity and a recognition maybe of why it's a good thing to be better at it. But there's a joy in being energized by what people say. There's a joy in engaging. I heard someone talk about those who are loud and those who are quiet in meetings, and somebody will say something. Any questions? I always felt compelled to ask a question because you've spoken for an hour. Do people really not have any questions? I've got hundreds of them. And yet I'm the only one who puts their hand up. And the quiet people go, he's talking again. Sorry. But I'm just as uncomfortable with the silence as you are with me speaking out. And I think perhaps talking about education, the problem is the default is to not ask why, to not say, excuse me, sir, I don't think that's right. When actually in a different world, we'd go, right, anyone got any different views? Yes, and there'd be a merit in that. Whereas, there's a certain amount of, of expectation that you do as you're told, and you cut your hair and you wear your uniform. And I get that. I get that there's a process, and somewhere between that and people who don't want to do that,
Have you ever considered what you would change about education, or you just think that there were problems and it didn't suit me that well, maybe it didn't suit my kids that well, and the school system's wrong and it's based on this antiquated way of doing things to cater to the norm, but what do we do different?
I think that the biggest issue and biggest challenge, I think there's a very broad brush to be had for this, is that idea that it's okay to be different. In other words, there isn't a single point that is how you should be. There's a broad spectrum of things, and I would include, we're talking about ADHD, I would include that is that there are those with more or less of that tendency, and that's fine. Do you know what? That's fine. My analogy, if you're the 7 foot tall guy, sure, there are situations where it's really difficult being 7 feet tall. There are some situations where it's absolutely fantastic to be 7 feet tall. Some people, sometimes it doesn't make any difference. So I think as long as, perhaps going back to what you said, as long as you understand who and what you are, you can look out for times to excel and times to go, well, this is going to be tricky.
And so you're not necessarily advocating for, I guess, a reimagining of the way a classroom is structured and all that business.
No, because it doesn't work like that. So we were talking earlier on about what an advocate is, and if I were to say I was at least an advocate for those who are different and neurodiversity, to coin a modern phrase, is I think it's okay to be different, but you have to conform to the system that exists, because that's how it is. So an advocate is somebody who sees how it is and seeks to get to how it might be. But as we've said, to understand that, you need to understand the complexity of education, the challenges of process, ATAR, universities, outcomes. And look, same as Donate Life, we get measured in outcomes that aren't necessarily about education. I mean, I'm sure you probably would argue like I would that getting good exam marks, is not necessarily a measure of who you are. I mean, my experience was high IQ meant brilliant. But actually, it also meant not much empathy, not very much
conformity either at that point.
No, absolutely. And as you, I think you said to me, high IQ is associated with, a certain amount of sociopathy, a certain amount of lack of empathy.
So when did you decide to conform? Was it when you were trying to get into university and go, you know what, I actually need to try and pass these exams to become a doctor?
Absolutely, because I was going to say there must have been a point at which you were like, stuff this whole, this system to some extent if it's not catering for me right now.
You
never had that sense.
I never had that sense of insight. I had absolutely no insight at all. I was ultra competitive. So it was only when someone said, no, medical schools have rejected you, that had me go, okay, well, that's not okay. And it coincided with me in between failing my first set of exams to get into medical school and failing my second set. I went to France and happened to nurse a dear old chap with really terrible rheumatoid arthritis who was close to death and suffering terribly, and I kind of ended up as a sort of cheap kind of nurse for him. And in between that time, I kind of discovered that I quite liked that.
What did you like about it?
I think I felt connected. It's really weird, isn't it?
You talk about lack of connection, but you really found something in connecting with that guy.
I think it was the first time I'd never seen anyone sick. I'd never been ill myself. I'd never had any kind of sense of...
Did you realise that you could do something about it and you could help in a certain way? Because you have dedicated your life to medicine, Donate Life.
Yeah.
There is an underlying desire to help people.
And ironically, I'm not even sure that some of that isn't just a desire to not conform. Like this poor chap, he was, it's terrible. He was kind of incontinent and stuff. And his wife didn't want me cleaning up, didn't want him. So I did. And I used to tuck it away and hide it away and bin it because, he used to cry out at night. He used to cry out, in pain and stuff. And I connected with that. And it's really weird. And we talked about, medicine as a challenge and whether you connect with the tragedies that you see. Medics are largely witnesses to other people's tragedies, other people's catastrophes. They're not ours. And so if you connect too much, you take them home with you. At the end of the day, you leave and you go back to your own family, you go back to your own life. Like I'm sure, as teachers, you see things, you see kids struggling, but you can't take them all home with you. But you have to have touched enough of that to go, do you know what, I want to do this better. And I think for this first time, this chap, I saw somebody suffering terribly and thought I could do, I actually don't mind this, and I don't mind helping him. And at that stage, that coincided with me not getting into medical school. So I went back to a place called the Royal Free in London and sort of knocked on the dean's door and said, I need to have a chat. And his secretary said, well, who are you? And I said, well, that's the point, isn't it? I just want to talk. And he kind of said, well, I waited 4 hours because I had an appointment, and he gave me 5 minutes, and in fact gave me half an hour, and he said, okay, well, we'll give you an interview. Even though in those days, again, a bit like education, there wasn't quite so much rigidity. In other words, the dean got to kind of say, do you know what, will let him in, even though I hadn't ticked all the boxes.
Yeah, you could see you were passionate about it, though. I guess with
it could, yeah. But
hours
do you know what? Lots of people are. I mean, that's the problem. You know, there's a certain academic demand of medicine that you have to satisfy. The question is that it's not just academia. That being a doctor is a lot more than that. And going back to your question about education, is how do you find people who have both the academic capacity and also.
So what did you argue? What were the points that you argued in that room?
I argued that intellectually, the medical schools, 5 out of 5 each time, had said this guy can do it, and I said, look, I've been really stupid. I didn't do any work. Now I know that's not a great argument, but I didn't know he was going to let me in. I didn't know he was going to let me in. And I said, look, I could have done better. I should have done better, and now I've realised that I really want it. And I think I could probably get teary, which was.
It's always helpful.
Well, that's the thing I do. And he, I mean, the other thing, look, I didn't know he was president of the rugby club. I didn't know that, and I happened to be a kind of first division rugby player. I didn't know that. But he said, well, I'll tell you what, we'll give you an interview. And that was it was kind of captain's, I think the Aussie phrase is captain's choice. But you know what? Then when I struggled with medicine because I couldn't be bothered to do any of the exams afterwards for a bit until I really got into it after medical school, I always felt like I owed the Royal Free something. I always felt like I owed Bruce McGilvery, who was the dean, I owed him something because he took a chance, and I felt like he had no reason to take a chance on me other than the fact that I was clearly desperate, and I'd discovered something in myself that I didn't know was there. And weirdly, that connection was something I probably then tried to avoid through my career because it's a painful thing and it's an exhausting thing to, like, look at the podcast that you do and clearly the passion in the time of night and the energy you put into it. It's exhausting and it's a personal commitment, and I seem to have an ability to both commit and also to stay sufficiently distant to most of it that I could survive, because you can't do that every day. You can't be passionate about it every day because I don't have the capacity to do that.
On that point, if we fast forward to your work as an anaesthetist, and you've mentioned that sort of that superpower that ADHD kind of brings you as far as this ability to hyper focus.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit more about how that helped you in that kind of a job?
Well, when I reflect back, particularly as an intensive care doctor, you might have 20, 25 patients, and each one of them is very complex. 10 or 15, 20% even if you work in a high-end unit might die, and each one of them has complexity and tragedy and suffering associated with them, but you've got 20 of them, and you have to do 5 minutes and maybe say hello to relatives and maybe hug someone or say hello, and that's all heartfelt. But you then have to go, right then, bed too. You have to, a bit like I always imagine, like if you're a CEO of a company or a headmaster of a school, you're bombarded with challenges that if you bury yourself, if you let each one of those things really prey on your mind, you can't think straight for the next one. And I discovered that, as I did, through anaesthetics, confronted with your emergencies and perhaps, a child who was the same age as my son or something, I found myself emotionally connecting and trying to avoid that because I couldn't think straight. Ironically, if I get called to your emergency, one that you've precipitated as, say, the anaesthetist, then I'm, okay, let's sort this out, because it's not my emergency. I can think straight. I can, whereas if it's mine, then it's my career, it's a life, it's the mother, so actually all those emotions actually confuse what is effectively a scientific situation, which is 2 + 2 = 4, and I need to make that happen. And so, I use the phrase, I used to care for people, not about them, and I say that in a very sincere way, that I would care for them absolutely and get it absolutely right and spend all night and day thinking and working at that, but I didn't care about them because actually that would confuse. The emotion would cloud my logical thought. We talked about pilots and how if you have an engine failure, you need to be absolutely precise about it, not be running up and down the aisle shouting, we're all going to die. You just can't do that. And I think that ability to separate yourself is in itself a talent. I mean, my wife would tell you I would have been a terrible GP. And I say that because GPs have an amazing capacity to engage and to be more of a community person, whereas I looked after people who were unconscious, who, frankly, the moment they were able to be annoying, we kicked them out. We used to look for people in intensive care who started to fight and rage because that means they were going to survive. That's the only way out of intensive care, is to find that fight and that will. And so as soon as they did that, we kicked them out. Now, I don't know what happened to them afterwards. And that was my experience with intensive care. When I found myself in intensive care or woke up, I had no idea that I was there. I knew I was in intensive care, I didn't know I was a patient.
So for those listening, you also had your own experience.
Yeah, I did.
How did you get there? And
so I've got into cycling, and typically obsessively was kind of got up to about 400k a week, and went over to ride in a charity ride over in Melbourne, Amy's Grand Fondo, and there's a long descent into Apollo Bay, about 10 kilometres descent, and apparently
it took a long descent into something else.
Well, there's a hairpin halfway down apparently, and there's a lamppost on the corner signalling the hairpin, and I hit that head on.
How fast were you going?
I've got thankfully your bike computer is very helpful and tells you you're doing 65k. So I hit it head on at 65k. So it split my jaw in half. Broke my neck, C5 and 6 were broken, so they're all plated and bone grafted. Tore my ear off, the helmet tore my ear off coming off. Shattered my arms, chest, ruptured liver and kidney.
Were you completely knocked out at that point?
No, apparently not. So I remember just before, and then apparently, there are all sorts of things incredibly lucky. I was found by it. I was on my own when it happened, because I was, I'm a bit chubby, so on the flat, I'm the one at the front, and everyone's following me. And then we come to the hills, they all go way off. So I was catching them up down the hill. I figured, because again, I'm slightly reckless. And in fact, I crashed on my own. And in fact, the first person who found the bite was an intensive care nurse who I've actually spoken to since. So she found me, and I wasn't breathing, my airway was blocked, so my jaw was cut in half and all that. And look, she opened my airway. She said your pupils were fixed. She said I thought you were dead, but I did what we talked about. We were talking earlier on about you open the airway. The reason it's A, B, C is just do A. Don't worry about B and C. She said, I opened your airway and you kind of took a big breath and your pupils came to life and so then they helicoptered me into Melbourne, and it was only on the way into Melbourne I started to deteriorate again, and they put a tube in. So I was then in intensive care for a week.
Did you have any of those, life flashing before your eyes kind of experiences in that process as you were?
No, so I remember descending and it being really cold, and the front wheel chattering and the carbon wheels, all sort of thing. And literally with no brake. So I'm on the bike and, always cold, and then Dad, and I opened my eyes, and it was my son. My son was holding my hand, and that was a week later. And that's about the only thing I remember for about a year. And I don't know why I remember that. My wife says that she said the next day you were lying there and you were looking at your wristband, and you were playing with it, and you said to me, I think I've cracked this. She said, oh yeah, what's that, love? So I'm a patient. And she said, yeah, I know that, you've been here for a week. And she said I used to come into the hospital and you'd be looking at other people's wounds and wandering around in your pajamas. And I said to you, what are you doing? So I'm just checking his wound. She said, no, I know that, but why are you checking his wound? She said, he looked at me and went, I don't know. And I take that because I like the fact that for all the things that had happened, right in the core of me was I'm in a hospital and I'm a doctor, so let's look at people's
Back
wounds.
to old habits.
And it's kind of tragic, and it's kind of tragic, and yet
So you can't remember any of that?
no, not at all.
What were the actual injuries to your brain?
So I had what's called a diffuse axonal injury, which means that the as you hit the lamppost, your brain, your head stops rapidly, so your brain's thrown forward, and then the Roy call is thrown backwards and then thrown forwards again, and your nerves are set at 90 degrees to each other, and they have a certain strength to them. So what happens is as you go forward and backwards, they shear each other, so they cut across each other. So you get this sort of generalized smashing of tiny parts of your brain. And so it's not particularly clear on a scan. So I had some bleeding, but they didn't have to open my brain, which is very lucky. But what you don't know is how much of the brain has been mushed in those instants. So, and particularly those high energy decelerations. It's like for some reason, like, sometimes people survive car crashes, and yet they look okay, fine, but actually they're dead. Is that because the brain, even though there's not very much room, can move around very fast, and that shaking.
Can they determine what happened based on the symptoms?
No, often it's because it's diffuse across areas of thinking, areas of moving. It's very hard to tell what you're going to get. So my wife didn't know, Anita didn't know what I would be. First of all, it's would be able to walk, and then okay, you can walk. So there's some video of me actually walking for the first time. But then the higher functions, it kind of goes back to a bit of education, is actually, they're really complicated. Like, for example, one of the challenges that I have, and I've told you boys this already, is I don't recognise people's faces. And you would never know that recognising faces is a thing. But if I said to you, well, how do you know who I am? You go, well, I know your face. And I said, yeah, but what about my face? You go, I don't know, what you look like. Yeah, but what do you look like meet with who you are? And that in itself is a talent, like catching a ball. And I now struggle, like, and as I said to you, I will meet people in the street now, and Anita will go, my wife will say to people sometimes, by the way, Bruce may not have a clue who you are. And I've known them for 10 years. That's just how it is. And actually, that's been part of our journey, is being very open and saying, look, this is how it is, Bruce. Well, he might be tired, or he won't remember, or he might get a bit sweary, which we're trying not to do on this, because that's just how it is. And go back to ADHD, maybe part of it is being very open about, I'm good at this and I'm not good at that. And you know what? That's fine, isn't it? As you said, the education system has to accommodate that to a degree, and I have to accommodate my, like when I do live radio with ABC and Nadia and Jeff, I don't swear because I absolutely focus on not swearing. And it's exhausting. It's live radio. And that's quite hard work, but that's the gig. And so I figured that with ATAR and sort of those sort of things, that it's hard sitting in class, it's hard being focused, but that's the gig. That's how it is. And there'll be a time in the future when somebody will go, never mind all that. What did you just say? When you get to say who you are and you get to be much more of your instincts. But as we know, there are certain rules that you just,
bit of conformity.
You have to, yeah. And I don't. I don't like conformity at all. But you don't get to express what you want. You don't get an interview unless your CV has a certain number of tick boxes. You just don't. So you'll never get to say those other things, those ideas, because you have to get in the door.
So can I ask, what did it change about your outlook on life, in the sense that, it's obviously borne some as tragic as it was, and as hard as it's been, it sort of took you off on a whole nother tangent in life. What did you learn out of that experience that, for the benefit of
I'm incredibly lucky. I'm incredibly lucky, and I don't mean I'm incredibly lucky to survive, to survive that degree of head injury and neck injury and be able to both walk and talk is extraordinary, and I see it as a privilege, and I also feel compelled to do something with that. So I try to write now, but I'm now on a whole journey of learning how to write, because it turns out writing's really difficult.
So what are you writing?
And you got your own podcast, by the way.
Well, I have done some podcasting, although I found that so exhausting. I'm not sure. I'm writing. I run a memoir, and now I'm writing a fictional book about a doctor. You're supposed to write what you know, but we talked about, it's a bit boring if you just write what you know. So I'm trying to kind of think about what my experiences of medicine and my experiences of that self-worth and loss and tragedy, and it is how that might play out for somebody unlike me. But the funny thing is I knew nothing about writing, and now I go to things like the Margaret River Writers Festival, and it's fantastic. It's exciting, and so, and I do this with you. We would never have met if I was just head of organ donation, and that's not to belittle that, but that's to say that we get extraordinary people who change their career because they choose to. I never had the courage to do that. I only changed my career because I had to, because I couldn't do my job anymore. The amazing people are people who choose to do it because they can see the value in it. I see the value in it now. I'm incredibly lucky that I can be more creative. I can explore other parts of me that I'd never had before, and maybe get a chance to advocate for brain injury patients whom I now am a member of that community. Most people don't get that. They kind of get to 65 and kind of retire, whereas I got catapulted out. When I speak at medical conferences now, the first thing I say is I don't want to be here. I don't want to be up here telling you a story about loss, because I love medicine. I loved being a medic. I wish I was in the audience. I don't want to be here and talk to you, but that's how it is. And so let's make something of it. And I think I make it very clear that I've only ever had one brain injury. So I don't speak for the brain injury community. I can't tell you how it is to have a brain injury. I can only tell you how it is to have mine. And I thought that about ADHD. I thought, well, I can only tell you about my experience of ADHD, which has been brought on by the brain injury. And that's not to say it's the same as yours or your parents' experience of it.
So do you speak to lots of people with ADHD and see what their symptoms are like? Do you speak to other people with brain injuries and compare notes?
I spend a lot of time with people with brain injuries, and brain injury is a particular cause of ADHD or ADHD-like symptoms. And I really had the privilege of going to the ADHD conference in WA, which was fascinating and really tremendously educational and tremendously confronting. There's a lot of people there whose children are struggling with it, educationalists, psychologists, all those sorts of people.
Actually, can I interrupt you there, because I've got a great question here from one of our colleagues that I think, based on having just been to the conference.
You're going to interrupt me? That really? What's going
Sorry,
on here?
Bruce.
What's going on here?
I just thought it pertinent, given you've just come from this conference and you're probably loaded up with a whole bunch of interesting stuff.
I only stay for the morning because I've got ADHD. I'm not going to stay that long. I held my interest as long as I possibly could. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Well, she's said, there's a lot of negative press in the 80s and 90s.
Yep.
With questions being asked about the validity of ADHD as a medical condition, I guess characterised as that, and the ethics associated with, unnecessarily medicating children, parents often being blamed for poor parenting, schools for providing a lack of engaging curriculum and relevant curriculum, documentaries like the drugging of our children coming out.
It's a very long question, isn't it?
I'm almost there.
Okay. Because with ADHD, I pretty much switched off about 5 minutes ago. What's your point?
So how do you think things have evolved since that kind of characterisation to now going to this conference and listening to the views right now about ADHD? What do we know now?
Well, I know very little about ADHD. As I said to you, a neuropsychologist told me I had that, and I was the most obvious one she'd ever met who hadn't had that as a diagnosis. So I wasn't one that I had asked for. I think there's an increasing recognition of it. I think there's an increasing recognition that many other conditions are misdiagnosed, and actually there's a much simpler explanation, a much broader, which is ADHD. And I think there's also recognition that ADHD isn't a spot diagnosis; it's a broad tendency. It's a spectrum of
symptoms,
of challenges. Yeah, like as I said, I keep going back to being tall. You're tall and taller, or really tall, or massive, but they're all basically different kinds of height. And the fact is that depending on which level you are, there are more or less benefits and challenges. A bit like high IQ. It's good having a high IQ sometimes, but it's also tremendously difficult in other situations. And so I don't see it as I think we talked about ADHD. I don't like the word deficit in there. I don't like the word disorder. And I think it's unfortunate that we still use, I think, quite archetypal. Because I think as a parent, I suspect that it's quite distressing to hear those labels when actually it's a challenging enough subject as it is. I mean, I think I was a very challenging child and lucky to be clever as well. They're not necessarily
challenging. I mean,
I think being creative is the same.
You didn't have drugs, obviously, because you weren't diagnosed, and then.
No.
But I have, I know people. Kids that have ADHD, they get given drugs to try and compensate it, and it's almost as if they lose a little bit of their spirit. So, what are do you take drugs for it now?
So I take Ritalin originally after the crash to try to reduce my recklessness, because one of the characteristics in adults of ADHD is you can be a bit reckless, and I had a certain history of tremendous. I mean, I broke both my arms 3 months before the big bike crash, and I'd broken stuff skiing and all sorts of things. So I started taking it just to try to reduce it, because I'd gone back to driving as well. And when I was driving, I found myself having a certain sort of tendencies to do things that you really shouldn't do, and I don't need to extend on those.
So that was purely for impulse control,
absolutely,
not for attentional control.
And then when I started to try to write, I found that I was tremendously easily distracted. So I have to switch off the internet. I have to switch off everything else I'm doing. I mean, Stephen King, when he talks about writing, says you need to have a lockable door. He says you need to go in a room and lock a door and write, and do not come out till you've done it. Now, few people can do that, but because I've come to recognize my distractibility and my lack of focus, actually I do switch off the internet now, and Ritalin helps me write. It helps me focus and write, and the writing gives me great pleasure and a sense of self-worth, and I think there's real value in that. I think one of the things about whatever you do that's difficult, there has to be a value in it. We have things that we naturally do. If you're a surfer or a painter or whatever, it gives great pleasure, and you just do it. Like catching a ball, it's easy. But then there's a grey area where actually, if you work at it, you know what, I can do this better. Like I can do my homework. I can do what I've been told to do. It's a pain, but I can do it. Some things I'll never be able to do. And I find Ritalin extends the grey area to things that I can do more easily, and they're things that I want to do. And I think, going back to education, I think you have to want to succeed. You have to have a passion. I don't mind what it is. It doesn't matter what it is. It's for you to judge the merit of it, no one else. But you have to have a passion for that and find that. And then Ritalin, for me, has helped me write when I wouldn't have been able to write as much or as focused. I was going to say successful, but it's not necessarily yet, because I have a tendency, as we've found in this conversation, to be quite tangential and sort of disappear off. I mean, my old boss, when I went back to her to talk about medicine, she said, I've got no idea how you ever managed to be a successful doctor, because you're always talking about all these other ideas. You've always got these other sorts of things. And I think there's a challenge, there's a joy in children who have that tangential ideas. They're a joy, and they're also a frustration, because we're doing this now.
Yeah. So I guess
but what about this?
The question is, do we want to get rid of that? Does Ritalin get rid of that? And there's different. Did it take a while for you to get the dosage right? There's slow releases, fast releases.
I use a very small dose, and I use it at the short release one, because ironically,
You use it for a purpose.
Yeah,
which is to write.
exactly. So I can measure an outcome. I can measure a success. The other challenge, of course, is I, because of the brain injury, I tend to get very mentally fatigued. Ritalin kind of supercharges my ability to work. So it kind of, a bit like, dare I say, anyone who happens to have ever taken speed or these kind of drugs, is that they let you overdraw in your energy and sleep. At some point you have to pay back. You have to pay the reaper. So for me, if I take extra Ritalin because I'm really working on something, I really got into it, I will pay for that. And I have to be careful because actually it's not good for me to do that. And we all have to accept our limitations, don't we? We have to accept what we can and can't do. And again, I've got a wife and a family, and for all the amount that I want to write, I also have to try to be a decent human being and give them his attention, give them all the things. I mean, my wife, Anita, carried me for 3-4 years, and in some ways she still carries me for a lot of the things that I don't do or don't like to do. She's been remarkably generous and kind to me. So I kind of owe her, and my children, I owe them an attention. So I can't just hide myself in a room, take some Ritalin and write. It kind of doesn't work like that. So how does
your week get structured there around writing?
Structured.
If
no,
some semblance of structure is.
Yeah.
Because I remember reading a interview with Nick Cave, who was saying he essentially has the Stephen King view of, he's got an office.
Brutal.
I've got a piano, I've got a desk, I've got a pen. I go in there 9 to 5, and then I'm with my family after that. But and some days they're horrible and no creativity comes out of me whatsoever. But I just grind it out every day.
And aren't those people? Those people are remarkable. If you've got creativity and an extraordinary work ethic, you are literally Superman, Superwoman. A bit like sports people who are super talented and have a work ethic. They're remarkable. There's no one who's a world champ who doesn't work like a brute. The Federers, the Nadals, the Elon Musks. They work incredibly hard. As a talent, being able to work is a talent. Whereas we know lots of flawed geniuses who, frankly, they wasted their talent. We didn't waste it. They didn't have the additional bit, which was being able to work hard. So I fell somewhere between. I found when it really came down to it, I could really work. But going back to structure, without the structure of, like, if I'm your anaesthetist, you tell me when to turn up, what cases, how long we do, and when they're done, I go home. So I have nothing to do with the structure. And one of the big challenges for ADHD, particularly, and brain injury, is when you're injured, there's no structure. And actually, the first thing that brain injury units do is they give you a whiteboard and they say 8 o'clock, you get up, 8:15, breakfast, because actually that map of your day is completely gone. And what they do at the brain injury unit, if you don't get out of bed, they take your bed away. Because unless you get back to some structure in your life, you're constantly just wandering around. And I found that a lot. You see, when I was injured, I wasn't put on the brain injury unit. I was on the unit next to it because, he seems all right, that bloke. He's all right. He's wandering around. And actually, I was allowed into the brain injury unit, but I wasn't taught those things about. So the first time I went to the brain injury unit was about 18 months ago. And the senior sister, who's a remarkable woman, Sandy, she said, well, do you use a whiteboard? I said, what are you talking about? She said, your whiteboard? I said, no. She said, will you write down what you're going to do? I said, what are you talking about? And she said, well, that's part of the reason why you're exhausted, is because you don't have a map of what your day looks like. It's a bit like if you're driving and you don't know where you're going. You're having to focus on much more. Whereas if you know the way, you don't even think about it. Like when you're a driver and you've been driving for years, you can drive for 8 hours and you don't notice really. But if you're a new driver, that's exhausting because there's so many other inputs. So what they try to do with the brain injury people is go, look, put a structure in so that you know what you're doing, so you don't have to think about it. It's like when I drive, sorry to keep going, when I drive a car, I have the GPS on, even when I know where I'm going. Because I don't have to think about it then. I don't have to think where I'm going. It's there. And that I have a very limited bandwidth as to what I can focus on, which again is a product of ADHD plus the brain injury. So I'm very limited in what I'm doing. I'm doing really well. But my wife will tell you, if she talks to me when I'm trying to write, she might as well talk to the wall. And I know how annoying that is. God love her, she's patient, but I wouldn't have a clue what she said. And it looks like you're not interested, but I just don't. And again, I think ADHD, you just don't have the capacity to do that. And it's.
Is there some extent to which, though, now your focus is limited by some of the things that have occurred with the brain injury, but now because you're doing less, but you're doing it in the way you want it, in the sort of frame that you want to do it, and so you can focus on these things.
There's a joy in that.
You don't have a array of complex things that you're trying to achieve every day.
No, I have very few people I talk to. I have very few social interactions. I never answer my phone. I don't like the phone because I don't know why you're ringing. I quite like text because you can kind of plan it. I don't like, and again, I'm not trying to say that's how it is for anyone with ADHD, but I don't like unexpected stuff. I like it planned, and so I'll ring you back. Don't get me wrong, I'll ring you back once I know what I'm going to say and when it's a time that I want. And the same with texting, at least you can, and I figured that perhaps, again, those people with ADHD in a classroom, they don't like the chaos, they don't like the what are we doing? This is what I want to do. And again, you don't get to, I think that's the thing, again, we're talking about this is the theme, isn't it? You don't get to choose all the time what you do. You just have to accept that sometimes you will do and sometimes you won't, and the times when you do get to choose, you might excel. And if you're a parent, I think you have to have faith. Hard as it is, I think you have to have faith that it'll work out. And as an employer, they're looking for people who are a bit different. They're not looking for people who are the same. And so if you feel a bit different, again, whether that's your ADHD or your gender or your sexuality, whatever, if you feel a bit different, I think that's great, good. And hopefully society kind of accepts that a bit more and you kind of find a middle ground where you can prosper.
Well, I think we're nearing the end of our
1
hour, aren't we? We've still got some quick fire questions for you, Bruce.
Go for it.
I had a whole string of questions here, but in a sense, you've actually answered most of them. I'm just looking down the list here. So I think, it's amazing. You've obviously somehow telepathically known how to dance around from one question to the next, so that's amazing.
Dancing around is true. That is one of the charms of my particular channel. I mean, look, as I said, mine is only my experience, and the reason I think these conversations are important because they start a conversation. They don't define your child, mine, your experience of it. They just say, this is how it was for me. And I said that with brain injury. I mean, to go on, I used to joke about the fact that as an anaesthetist, I probably witnessed 900 or 1,000 deliveries, babies. I've never had a baby. My mum's had 6 kids, but she's never had your wife's or your partner's. So who's the expert? In other words, all you can actually do is say, this is how it was for me, and then listen. You shut up and listen and go. Because when someone goes, oh, it's easy, someone else goes, what? The epidural was fantastic. No, it wasn't. So what I'm saying is that our own personal experience, we often draw upon, unless we listen, which is ironic coming from me, unless we listen carefully to what other people say and then go, say that again.
Mm. You've also mentioned, though, that we are drawn to certainty, drawn to patterns. We want answers that we can generalise.
Absolutely.
We don't tend to want to accept that your experience is radically different from mine.
No.
There's not, there might just be no common ground there, sort of thing.
Absolutely. No, we definitely, the only thing that's certain is uncertainty, and we all struggle with that. Look at COVID, how we wanted to know, well, if I get the vaccine, will I definitely be okay? No. Will it affect me? Well, it might do. Well, okay, so I'm not going to then. In other words, we're very averse to taking risks. And again, there's another talent, is some people are quite comfy with uncertainty. ADHD people, generally speaking, are not. They tend to be intolerant of uncertainty. And so they tend to be very rigid, and this is how it is. because that stops me having to.
Were you saying it earlier on, though, in terms of education, that it would be good to have more choice? Is that what, I can't remember exactly what you were saying in terms of what you would change about education for yourself, like given, was it freedom of choice or something? But I don't know whether that contradicts.
Well, I think.
I think you're challenging that assumption.
Well, I don't know. I know a lot about medical education. What I would say is that we've tried to push towards being intelligent is fine, but that is not the issue with being a doctor these days. It is absolutely not about being intelligent. You have to be intelligent to have the capacity to absorb and utilize a lot of information, but that is not what patients want. They don't want a flipping genius. Okay, there's a few, and I would hate to say neurosurgeons and cardiothoracic surgeons as good groups of people who typically are very good at what they do, and largely that's it, because that's what they're good at. And similarly, as I said, GPs have particular talents that we really don't. Again, rather like teachers, I always think about GPs and teachers the same, is that, oh, he's a generalist. But actually, they're the absolute core of our healthcare and our education. What I think we said about generalists, why do we belittle those who are able to absorb a broad content, whereas, just doing anaesthetics was pretty easy. You sit there and the patients turn up, whereas the generalists, the teachers, they're the ones that have the real challenge, because they have to absorb the ADHD and the creative and the not and the this and the that. That's where the talent is, and I think we don't celebrate that enough. And again, I think I'm not one to speak about generalists, because at school I was the annoying one who, frankly, I was better thrown out of class. Now, could I have been accommodated better? Well, I was put up 2 years in school just because I was super clever. But nowadays, an educationalist would say that was the worst thing you could have done, because all it did was focus on the fact that the kid was good at exams. Who cares? Do you know what I mean? Who cares that you're good at exams? Because, like IQ testing, we know IQ testing does nothing other than test the IQ test. It doesn't say anything about your ability to cope or succeed. And so I think schools are really challenged. I'm not sure, I'm definitely not the person to talk about how schools, I think we should be very sympathetic. I don't want to blow smoke anywhere that would be rude, but I think for you guys, I think to even spend time talking about education and talking about different views of the same thing, that to me is the start of it.
And I think, as you've mentioned,
start a conversation, talk about it, and go, tell me, this is how it is from my point of view. Now tell me about you. Tell me about how it is for you. Tell me about you as a pupil, as a teacher, as a parent.
And I think, fundamental here at Scotch is this notion that you're building relationships.
Absolutely.
That's central to being a teacher, is figuring out what makes that kid tick in your classroom. And he might be vastly different to your personality type, but you've got to, and I think you touched on that idea that you've got to try to understand.
And I don't know how teachers do, and I don't know how, I genuinely don't know how teachers do that, because I know that you've got so many things to do, so many boxes to tick, so many children, so many contexts. And as I said, look, people used to say, well, it's very difficult being an intensivist, all those people. And I would go, no, it isn't. It's really easy. What you do, that's really difficult, because there's no way I'm doing that. My 25 people are all unconscious and not moving. And if I decide they're going to wake up, I'll wake them up. Your lot are running around the class, and I think that, there isn't enough. The very fact that you're hosting this conversation, that's where the value is. Is there's not enough conversation, and look, WA isn't the most necessarily always quite so open to ideas and stuff. And I think the more of these conversations, to simply say, well, I don't feel like that, I'm not the same as that. Start with that. Start with recognising that I'm not the same as you, and that's fine. Because there's the conversation. There's the joy of being a human being, is that I'm not like you. If I was like you, it'd be really boring. If it was like me, I wouldn't listen to a word you said, and we'd all just sit here and not talk to each other.
Well, that's an awesome way to almost finish our interview.
All very valid.
And if you want to listen to me talking to myself, then there is a podcast, Dr. Bruce Powell, where I talk to myself about stuff. Which
well, we're going to get to that. Actually, we're going to get to that. But we always have a couple of quickfire questions for our guests.
Quickfire. Good luck with that.
Before we give you a chance to share a bit about your podcast and what you're writing,
Well,
and hopefully give us the title to your new book.
No, I can't tell you.
Oh, okay.
I'll be writing in a pseudonym because it's yeah. I'm not even going to talk to you about what that. I'll share it off.
There could be some controversial content.
No, it would be, and it won't be in my name.
Okay. All right. Well, Deserted Island, favourite album.
This is how old I am. You see, I would go with Human League Dare.
Oh, really?
Yeah. What do you mean, really?
I just think cheesy 80s. But
It's not cheesy 80s. Don't you want me, baby?
yeah, it's as cheesy as
It's not cheesy. You're 43, aren't
look,
you?
I'm in an 80s cover band. We did.
You're an
consider
80s. What do you play?
guitar, vocals.
No, what? No,
What kind of music?
stuff?
Well, recently we just did an 80s gig. So we didn't play any Human League. But
Who'd you play? Did you play the Jam?
we did a bit of Angels, did some like
Paul Weller.
Aussie rock.
Aussie rock.
Yeah.
Really?
Excess.
Oh, okay.
Um,
That's terrible.
What else did we do?
Did you do any Duran Duran? Did you do Spandau?
No.
What do you mean, no? What
We did a bit of Talking Heads.
Okay, my wife loves Talking Heads.
Yeah.
Get the big suit on.
Yeah.
I love that. Okay. I need to come and watch you then.
Well, he's in a band as well. Wasn't
Is
in a band
he?
As well, yeah.
You two.
We've
are-
played a
Russian
bit of
Winters.
music.
He's on Spotify.
You do. What do you play then?
Wow, the band is disbanded now. We actually had a reunion last week.
Did you?
Just a quick catch up. One bloke's in London now, one's in Melbourne, but we're all.
Did you play Roxy music stuff?
Indie rock kind of stuff.
Indie. What's that? Who's that then? The Clash.
Foals.
Who?
More recent kind of stuff. So
okay.
Foals, Interpol was a big influence.
Yeah, I've got no idea. What you're
Bands
talking
from the
about
sort of 2000s.
2000s. Wow. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
not really. No.
Not as cheesy as Human League.
Actually, I'll tell you a big influence on the lead singer, The Cure.
Okay, so I don't
That
mind the
kind
Cure.
of stuff. Yeah.
Paul Weller's my hero.
Ah,
the Jam were
the great mod.
Yeah, the Jam were. But then in my day, you had to choose between Duran Duran and Spandau Ballet.
Yes.
I was Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark because I just thought they were really cool. So I know. Look, I'm a lot older than you boys. Don't sit there.
Did you ride around on a Vespa by any chance?
No
and wear
way,
a
man.
big...
Man, there is no way I'm getting on a motorbike. We've already heard about the trouble I got into riding the bike. Under no circumstances suggest other things.
It's the mod. It was the mod thing.
No. Fishtail Parkers and things. I'd like to know. I was a sort of ripped jeans and I was a bit of a jock really.
Oh, okay.
I was kind of ripped jeans and I was terrible. I wasn't fashionable at all. My wife Anita was super fashionable, and I absolutely wasn't. I was terrible. I was really
All right.
embarrassing.
All right. What book or books has had the most profound effect on you, or are there any books that you would most recommend?
I forgot the name. I actually, it was the 15 Lives of Harry. There's a really amazing book, and it's about a kid who dies and comes back and remembers. Anyway, that. But I'm a massive. I'm such a nerd, which I never thought about before. I have a real thing about quantum physics. So if I try and read a fiction book, I'll skim it because whatever, just move the story. I don't care about what it looks like, about the scenery, the conversation. Right, he's doing that, and so I would skim through books. And I bought Stephen Hawking's book about about the British history of time.
Yeah.
And my wife said to me, I was reading it. She's going, "What are you doing? You're still reading the same page?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Why are you doing that?" I said, "I don't understand what it means." And so she said it was the first book she'd ever seen me actually read the sentences and actually try to understand what that meant. And I love that. And the biggest thing I've taken from quantum physics is that actually uncertainty is at the very core of the existence of the universe. And I know
at a material level, right?
and absolutely at a physical level, stuff materializes out of nothing and disappears again. And I kind of think, well, okay, so the fact that I don't really know what I'm doing tomorrow is not such a huge thing. And my wife will go, "Yes, it is." So I kind of like that. So I went to see Brian Cox, and Brian Cox to me is the David Attenborough of physics. In other words, he's had people realise why it's important. Like he discusses black holes in 5 minutes, which on black holes we don't understand the physics, but the fact is they're miraculous. And so if you ever wonder what's the point of, I don't know, recycling, well, because in a bigger term, the Earth is a unique, extraordinary place, And it may be the only place in the known universe that exists. So if you're never quite sure whether you should be careful with the environment, just think, well, it's the only one within a billion light years. And I quite like that. And David Attenborough kind of does that with natural history. He says, look, it's really extraordinary. Maybe that, and the same about education, you know, if you don't get that what teachers do is extraordinary, have a think about it, because it really is, never mind medicine, but teaching and you know, and I'm not trying to, again, blow smoke anywhere, but I have the time now, the luxury of the time to sit around and have a think. And that's the biggest privilege. Going back to your question about the crash, the biggest privilege it's given me is time. Mm. And we were talking about, your
nothing more valuable, is there?
No, and your amazing decision to devote yourself to teaching, and I think it's a really beautiful thing. And as I said, I think very few people have the courage to do that, and the insight to see that it has real value. And look, it's difficult sometimes to find the value in stuff, isn't it?
Well, it's always monetary for most people.
It is, and I get that. And again, that's life, isn't it?
And people are in different situations, aren't they?
Yeah, so. Absolutely. And there's nothing wrong with that. Again, my only argument with that is that if you're lucky enough to be well off, then acknowledge it. Good on you. I'm not saying, but what I'm saying is don't if you don't, like, similarly, if you walk on Cottesloe Beach every day and you don't see the beauty, then you need a good look at yourself. Because most people who come here and we go for a bit of a casual walk, they go, "Oh my God, it's gorgeous," and you go, "No, it is actually." Mm. In other words, like, my crash has had me look back at all the fantastic choices and opportunities and joys I had and go, "God, I'm lucky." Mm. And isn't it ironic that we only see that when we nearly lose it? Mm. That's the thing, isn't it? Is the question is, can you see it without losing it? Can you appreciate what you've got without losing it? And I think that's a real challenge for all of us. Mm. Come on.
All right, to finish, last one. If our audience,
you've already
Bruce,
poo-pooed me about the dare thing, so I'm not
not going to go into music again.
Okay.
That's just.
Yeah, I'll embarrass myself.
I'll give it another listen.
Okay. Yeah.
If our audience wants to learn, well, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much, Bruce, for coming in and being so candid with your life.
Thank you. Well, thank you.
It's fantastic, and especially we've got a lot of students here as well with ADHD.
Yeah.
And a lot of staff who are wanting to get a better understanding of it. And obviously, your life is much more than just ADHD, and that was amazing. All the stories you've shared. So thank you for that.
And as I said to you, I don't
really informative. Yeah.
And as I said, I don't get to tell anybody how ADHD is. All I can tell you is how it is for me, and how it hasn't always been easy, and it hasn't always been a handicap, and sometimes it's been a superpower. And you just have to have the faith that you'll find your place in it all. And I think if you do have to work hard, and if you're lucky, it sometimes goes your way, and that's all I can say. And what's your question?
That's brilliant. That's a good end right there, isn't it?
Give me the question.
Come on, give me the question.
All right. If our audience wants to learn more about your story and your work, where can we find you?
So, BrucePowell.com. I spent some time podcasting about the experiences of waking up, and about trying to explain what it's like to kind of know and not know, and then a little bit about hope, and about talking about being there's a podcast about my experience as being an organ donor leader, and what an extraordinary experience witnessing someone deciding to give part of themselves to someone else. And just to touch on it right at the end, organ donation remains a remarkably close to my heart, because I think it's the most extraordinary expression of human generosity, that someone might give something of themselves to someone else. Mm-hmm. And again, I've always been touched by that. And in a different world, I would have had an Australian Order of Merit posthumously, because the lamppost would have made me brain dead and I'd have been an organ donor. Now that must have got me on the honours list, surely. But it turned out it didn't. So I'm still, as I said, a real fan and a real advocate. I said to you earlier on that only 15 or 20% of men are even registered on the organ donor register, and the fact is that it takes 5 minutes and you never have to think about it again. And I think that's a really important thing. And somebody once said to me, well, what's the point? Because you'll never know. If you ever become an organ donor, you're the only one who'll never know. And I said, okay, well, it won't do anything for you, but it does say something about you. If you put your name down, that's what you'd like to happen. It says something about you. And I think surfers and footy players and family people, and they're the kind of people that do that. So just take those 5 minutes. You can do it electronically, stick your name on it, and then, like I said, you never know. If worst comes to the worst, you might save someone else's life.
That's brilliant. All right, thank you very much, Bruce. That was fantastic.
Thank you both.
Thank you.